So as I said, myself, and then we're going to be joined, or we have been joined by Republic of Media and Gusto to go through the That Counts campaign. Then we'll have a break at about 3 o'clock, sorry, at about 2 o'clock. And that's an opportunity for anyone who wants to leave the session to depart, and we'll also be joined by some walking colleagues. And then Diva, who are a creative agency for the walking campaign, will kind of take over and drive the last hour of the session. There is a kind of we've kind of scheduled it so that all of the question time is at the end, but I think if anyone's got questions that emerge during the presentation, if you want to drop them into the chat box, then we can kind of pick them up and have a look at them. And the other thing just to say is, although we've got 2 hours, there's an awful lot of detail in the presentations that the agencies are going to share with you. So they will pull out the salient highlights from their kind of particular sections, but they are not going to necessarily kind of cover everything that you see on the slide deck. So it might be that you kind of have questions that are covered within the slide deck that just don't get mentioned in the narrative presentation. But in any case, we will share the slide decks after today's session so everyone can have a good look at them. And then, as always, can kind of come back to us with any questions that you might have, you know, in the days ahead. Okie doke, so just flicking on then if you could, Nicole. So I just, I mean, you don't need me to say that this 2020 hasn't been the year that any of us hoped that it might have been or planned for it to be. And this is just really to kind of, if we can travel back in time to the beginning of this year, we were actually started off 2020 in a really good place. So we'd just had delivered the first phase of our That Counts campaign, and we'd had some quite encouraging, that had run from September through to the end of November. So we were coming into 2020 in quite a good place with a kind of a launch of one campaign with some encouraging results. You see there a couple of the highlights from the first phase of the tracking research that we've done. And we also, if you want to move on to the next and final slide from me, Nicole, we had planned, we kind of had a comprehensive marketing plan together for the whole of 2020, which really gave us, we had a presence from March right the way through to end of July, and then picking up again from September through to November across both of our campaigns, and also another project which we deliver in Greater Manche, which I know most of you know about, which is the Walking Festival, which was going to happen in May, and we had kind of a comprehensive comms plan around that as well. So as well as kind of a presence across the year, we actually had a really strong kind of channel mix. So we were looking at, you know, mix across all of the campaigns and activity, television, radio. We had a really strong partnership planned with the Manchester Evening News to deliver a magazine supplement, which was also going to be we were doing overruns going to targeted postcodal areas. We had our out-of-home posters. We had that brilliant piece of work that we were going to do with pharmacies in April. And then, of course, we had budget invested across digital media. So we had a really strong kind of plan together. And obviously what you're going to hear now from the agency is how we've overcome, you know, we've had deferment of media channels, we've had to pull things, kind of swap and change the media around for the year. And obviously the campaigns, both the campaigns have been impacted by the lockdown. But yeah, so the agencies will share a bit more about that in their presentations, but I just thought it was worth setting a bit of context that the plan that we've delivered is not the ideal plan that we'd hoped to deliver at the beginning of the year, but I think we've kind of done our best. Okay, so unless anyone's got any questions for me at this point, I will, and I don't think you should have, but if you have, drop them into the chat box. I'm going to hand over to, is it Will going to drive for Ron?
Yeah, I'll kick it off.
Okay. You're going to take it in turns, or is it you right the way through, Will?
No, we'll chop and change as we go through.
So just to introduce you to Will then, so anyone who came to the session that we did in February, way back in Friends Meeting House, will have met Will and Natalie and Donald from the agencies for our That Counts campaign. But Will is from Republic of Media, and they're the media buying agency for That Counts. So lovely, over to you. Thanks, Will. Lovely.
First of all, just thank you very much for everyone for taking the time out to join us. We appreciate it. It's a busy time of the year. So if we just flick onto the first slide. So what we're going to kind of take you through in a very whistle-stop manner across the next 20 minutes is essentially phase 3. So phase 3 is the third instalment of the campaign, which ran across September and October. So kind of like I said, between me and Nat, we'll give you a quick overview of how that ran. So in terms of what we were aiming to do, we were aiming to build on the foundation that we built last autumn with phase 1. And to do so, we kind of started or maintained the multi-channel approach, which ran across radio, a number of out-of-home formats, and also paid social. Moving on. So kind of as Helen Louise has adhered to there, it's not been the year that we wanted. Obviously, the last time we all caught up like this was back at the start of February, and we were kind of reeling out and rolling out our grand plans for phase 2 to run across kind of the spring period. But the small matter of a global pandemic put paid to that. So I thought before going into the detail of phase 3, it's worth just giving a nod to what should have ran in phase 2. So a lot of the activity was actually deferred because obviously since we went into a national lockdown, we just couldn't run the media format. So our full 6-sheet campaign, which is the 6 sheets that preside within each individual borough, the ad lifts across the Trafford Centre and the Airedale, half of our radio campaign with Capital Manchester and all of our social campaign had to be deferred. Fortunately, we could defer this back to phase 3 to give it a robust campaign, which Nat will come on to in a second. Unfortunately, there was also some activity that we just couldn't push back. So there was some other 6-sheet activity with M4 that was due to go out across the city centre in some prominent locations. That couldn't happen anymore. And I think, as Helen Louise has alluded to in one of her slides, we were also going to have quite a heavy presence across over 600 pharmacies in the region, but COVID certainly put paid to that one. So moving on. I think it's also just important to reiterate and consider the context that our phase 3 campaign was up against. Obviously, we're all aware that Greater Manchester, since the start of summer, has probably been host to the most severe restrictions at all times. So I kind of just wanted to outline here what we were battling with in this sense. So when the campaign kicked off at the start of September, it was the case that households weren't allowed to mix indoors and the rule of 6 applied. Moving through to the midpoint, working from home was re-encouraged and then very quickly discouraged 2 days later. Before, I suppose, the infamous image in the bottom right of Andy Burnham finding out on live TV that we were put into tier 3. I think whilst obviously there were restrictions at play, we were far more fortunate than phase 2. Obviously there wasn't a full-on lockdown in place. Even when tier 3 came into play at the back of October, it was very much towards the end of the campaign. Plus, with our 6 sheets and ad lifts still live, the Trafford Centre and the Airedale was still open. People were still allowed out and about. So we weren't impacted too much. Moving on. And from our perspective, it's also important to consider and take into account that COVID-19 has had a massive and profound effect on just the media landscape. Consumer habits have changed unlike any other year. In some instances, it's accelerated trends that we had started to see. So without going into too much detail, obviously we know that out of home and cinema in particularly have had a difficult year because of all of the lockdowns and the restrictions. Yet on the flip side, the likes of online activity, social media usage, radio listenership and TV viewership, those numbers and figures have absolutely soared through the roof. Which, moving on to the next slide, in terms of what all of this meant for our campaign, it's actually quite positive. So radio and out of home have stood very, very strong. So there's a bit of research there on the left-hand side that Radio Centre did in October, which, so they're the governing body for all radio listenership, that over a third of commercial radio listeners are actually listening to more than they were pre-lockdown, which is an extra hour and a half a day, which is very positive and works in our favour. And from an out-of-home perspective, obviously there have still been restrictions in play, but live and up-to-date data suggests that we're actually, from a Northwest perspective, we're above benchmarks in terms of footfall on the high streets and exposure to small formats, which is kind of your 6 sheets, which we ran on the TFGM network and in the boroughs. So all in all, it's been a positive picture for us, despite obviously being a very fragmented year for media. So pulling this all together, so obviously I've mentioned that the 6 sheets, the lift finals, some of the radio and the paid social, that's deferred and was pushed back from phase 2 to phase 3 to kind of give it a more well-rounded feel. We topped up the Capital Manchester campaign with another 2 weeks, re-added in the bus streetliners to ensure that there was kind of that broad coverage and frequency achieved across all of the boroughs. And we also reintroduced the Transport for Greater Manchester 6 sheet and poster sites across their network. Next one. And the outtake of all of that is that we actually, contrary to phase 2, we will manage to achieve very robust coverage across all of the boroughs as planned. All of our activity managed to run to plan, which is great news. And I think luck was slightly on our side as well, because the week after the campaign finished, obviously we went back into a national lockdown for November. So we're very happy with how the campaign ran, all things considered. I'll pass you across to Nat now, who will kind of give you a bit more detail by channel.
Thanks, Will. So just moving on to the campaign performance section. So if you just carry on to the next slide, thanks, Nicole. So I guess the context, obviously, of the campaign was fairly turbulent. We had a lot of deferments, as kind of Will's teed up in the first section of the pres. But what we can see is that overall we really delivered, strong results irrespective of this. And I think I'll kind of go on to detail per channel in the slides to follow. So I won't sort of labour on this slide too much. On to the next one. So from a radio perspective, so I think obviously, as Will mentioned, we were originally due to run a 4-week-long campaign in March as part of the second phase. And then unfortunately, we found ourselves in a position where we effectively had to defer 2 weeks of that activity through till the September-October period. And then I guess to ensure that we had a kind of robust campaign running that was of equal weight into phase 2, we actually topped that back up to a 4-week campaign. I guess the other thing to note as well is that we switched our station mix. So I know this is something that Will mentioned earlier as well, from Hits Radio to Capital Radio Manchester. And again, that decision was purely based on the fact that we know that Capital Manchester has a far superior reach in terms of our key audiences, as well as kind of overarching across the Greater Manchester region. So in terms of overall delivery, so we're really pleased with the outcome of the campaign in itself, despite all this kind of disruption. And we achieved a really strong reach and frequency across the period. So I think we actually planned the campaign originally at a weight of 4.5 OTH, and we actually delivered above and beyond that at 6.6. So obviously really kind of driving that frequency of message. We also had the positive backdrop that Will kind of mentioned before, in that, a third more were listening to radio during the time in which the campaign was running. And also we kind of really were able to deliver that reach amongst our kind of key family and young people audience, so above and beyond what we achieved on Hits. So just moving on to the next slide. So I guess without wishing to steal sort of Gusto's thunder later on in the presentation, we actually saw on the back of, I guess, the tracking that we're going to be sharing later on today, really strong ad recall results. So that, I guess, so above and beyond the kind of media performance, we're actually seeing really strong campaign results as well. So we effectively doubled our recall versus what we'd achieved with Hits. And interestingly, our reach was particularly strong again amongst the kind of family audience, as well as BAME groups. So from an out-of-home perspective, so as kind of Will mentioned before, it was kind of probably the most worst effective of channels, just subject to obviously persistent lockdown measures, but due to the timings of the campaign and the way in which we planned it, actually we're able to achieve really sort of strong results, including significant overshow and added value as a result. So even now we're still seeing some of the kind of TFGM posters live across the network, but but also the ad lifts are also still present within the Manchester Arndale, which again, 2 months after the campaign has actually finished is, really kind of no mean feat. And I guess from an out of home perspective, so we actually picked the formats to deliver across 2 different objectives. So we had the tactical placement, so the ad lifts and the 6 sheets, which worked on a kind of more, as I said, sort of tactical level. The ad lifts were sort of designed to drive that genuine behaviour change within shopping centres, placed across areas near, with high footfall, to kind of really drive that message home. Whereas we had obviously the kind of 6 sheet activity, which whilst it was deferred, was obviously still largely in line with the original plans that we created. I think we only ended up having to move, I think 3 or 4 of the sites in totality, which is again like a sort of great achievement despite the disruption. And then secondly, we obviously had the streetliners, which obviously gave us that coverage again, both within the sort of key conurbations, but also the sort of city centre. And also the TFGM network. And again, I'll kind of go on to explain a bit more around those results. So just moving on. So from a streetline perspective, so this is kind of, so we deferred this activity. It was at a slightly, oh yeah, that's a very good point actually, Helen Louise. Yeah, so streetliners are the kind of bus ads that you see there to the left. So we deferred this activity from phase 2, but we ran at a slightly lesser rate than what we did during phase 1. I think we had about 170 panels, but we still were able to achieve, significant overshow throughout the campaign period. And I think there's still some running at this point in time, which again is kind of a really strong outcome. And then from a TFGM perspective, so I guess the kind of main thing to shout here is the fact that we were able to secure the new Trafford line, which, again, just kind of enabled us to kind of broaden that coverage further into some of the key boroughs. And also we know that some of the placements are still sort of live. And again, with it obviously being the lead up to Christmas, that's going to continue to deliver great overshow for us in really sort of high footfall areas. And then just moving on from a 6 sheet point of view. So as I mentioned before, we kind of were able to move and defer the entire plan without relatively no to little disruption. And that obviously went live in key conurbations, working in line with the original templates that you supplied. And then from a lift final perspective, again, as I mentioned before, these are still live as we kind of speak. So we had a slight change of position this time. So I think previously they were around the food hall. Yeah, and this time they were around the Arndale market. So again, that's a kind of really high footfall area. And it just helped us to, I suppose, make a bit of a point of difference for this campaign specifically. And then just finally, from a social point of view, so we were originally due to run this activity in March, and it was very much intended to be an evolution of the first phase of activity. So during the first phase, we had carousel formats running across Facebook and Instagram, and these were essentially targeted to our core audiences. As part of this phase, we kind of recommended that we change the core KPI from reach to ads, which is effectively your ad recall lift, to engagement. So really focusing on driving traffic and interest through to that counts social page. So the kind of key, I guess, targeting segments remained, but we kind of obviously shift the objective on, and also included some new formats. So we actually worked with Intelligent Conversation to basically put out some of their video assets that they created for some of the audiences. And we also used still image and story formats. And that was really to kind of maximise our delivery across Facebook and Instagram, and ensuring that obviously the creatives that we developed were platform agnostic and could optimise accordingly to which audiences were performing best. We also introduced a new segment which focused on benefits specifically to again sort of further develop the messaging and take it on to the next phase. And then just moving on to the next slide. So what we can see is that, I guess, the kind of upshot from this was that despite us obviously changing the overarching objective, which was, from reach to traffic ultimately, we were still able to achieve near comparable reach to what we achieved during phase 1. So I think we achieved 3.5 million reach in phase 1, and this time it was just 3 million. But then obviously you can see that obviously in changing the KPI, we were able to deliver, a huge number of clicks to sites, so over sort of 40k versus the 4.5 that we achieved during phase 1. And I think one thing to note here, and it's certainly not what we would have expected, but in terms of the efficiency of the overall campaign, it's, beyond what we see from an industry benchmark perspective. So just to kind of put it into context, we were seeing Facebook CPMs around 80% more expensive across this period. But despite that, we were able to achieve, a cost per click that was, far below what we'd expect. So that was a really strong result. And then just moving on. So I guess a lot of the campaign outcomes from a social perspective align really with what we saw during the first phase. So our families and young people audience really accounted for the majority of our overall impression delivery and also engagement. And I think that was kind of, I guess, one of the main roles of the channel in itself. We knew that that was going to be the core audience and that we were reaching through that platform. And then I guess from a kind of secondary point of view, obviously mobile is something that we see deliver really strong results for us. And this is something consistent across, a number of our clients, but it's also obviously representative of how consumers are, interacting with content more so now than ever, just obviously because of lockdown and the fact that use of desktop is becoming far more less so with people at home. So, and I guess that's kind of everything from a kind of overarching campaign performance perspective. I think Will's going to kind of take you through the next section, which is just a bit of a wrap up.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I suppose it's just what now, where are we now, and what do we do moving forward? So I won't bore you with all these details, because I'm sure you've seen it a million times across the past month or so, but obviously taking this from the most recent Active Live survey, it puts into perspective where we currently are across Greater Manchester. So I think obviously the survey goes up to May 2019. So in terms of May 2020, so in terms of the year to date and the full impact of coronavirus, that's still kind of up in the air, I suppose. So it just goes to show that we've obviously done a lot of work in the last 12 months with kind of two and a bit phases, but it shows that there is still work to be done moving forward, and there is a challenge ahead to be negotiated. So moving on to the next one, it's kind of just our thoughts in terms of what we could consider moving forward. Let's move on to the final slide. So I think one of the more startling stats that I saw was that across Greater Manchester in general, the figure is 72% of people are moving for more than 30 minutes a week, which is slightly below the national average. Kind of flip that on its head, and it suggests that there's over a quarter of people that aren't even moving for more than 30 minutes a week. Whereas obviously with the That Counts campaign, the messaging is to try and get people to move for more than 30 minutes a day. So there's already kind of a discrepancy, I suppose, there that needs to be tackled. How do we do it? I think out of home, and in particular the bus streetliners, they're quite fundamental in terms of achieving the broad coverage and reach, both of all of the boroughs and of kind of the 4 core audience cohorts as well. I think, says there, radio. I think the switch to capital has very much been vindicated, both just in terms of the pure figures and the delivery and the number of times the advert was heard and the amount of people we reached, the amount of relevant people that we're reaching as well for our audiences. And also, kind of, as Nat said, the actual recall of the ad as well. It's clearly a message that's sticking with the listeners. And we think radio will always, obviously dependent on budgets, it will always remain kind of the underlying media channel for any campaign, because it's the most cost efficient way of achieving broadcast reach across the whole region. And then I think kind of final point marries back with the first slide. It's almost like a lot of our campaigns are based around out of home, and kind of doing different, more tactical formats outside. However, we know that paid social is performing very well. We know that the media landscape has evolved humongously this year, and I suppose it's yet to be seen what trends will stick and which ones won't. But it's almost a case of, if that 28% of people are generally spending more times in their home, do we kind of need to shift the priorities and consider kind of other ways and other means of reaching them inside the houses? So plenty of food for thought. Obviously, it's been a year like no other, with one full campaign and one disrupted campaign. But I think, considering all of the context around it, we're quite happy with how everything's performed and how it's shaping up. And I think we might be bang on time as well, which is always good.
Good, you followed my strict criteria for timing, which is great. No, that's great. As I said, if anyone has got questions, then please just drop them into the chat box, because I know that the next set of slides from Donald are very detailed. So what you've had there is kind of the performance of the media, which is kind of one side of the coin, I suppose. So yes, that was what was delivered. That's what people have seen, but it obviously doesn't kind of give you any information about whether people have understood the advertising. They might have seen it, did they understand it, and have they acted on it? So that's where we pick up with the tracking research. So I'll introduce you to Donald again. Some of you may have met him if you came to the session in February. But Donald's joining us from over the Pennines, I think, aren't you?
Right, that's right.
Yeah, over the Pennines. So if I hand over to Donald, and again, Nicole's driving that presentation, and we'll kind of move on swiftly to give Donald as much time as possible to go through a huge slide deck of really detailed information. So just bear in mind, probably not covering every detail on the slide, but we will share them so that people can have a look at them in detail, and we'll obviously answer questions if people have got detailed, specific questions about the research. Okay, thanks, Donald.
That's great. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Nat and Will, for that previous session, and to everybody else for joining in. So, yeah, so as Helen was saying there, we've obviously got there's a huge amount of information behind this presentation. So we've given there's still quite a lot of detail to go through today, but it is essentially quite a truncated version. So there's lots of other information behind that in the appendix and so on. But hopefully, within this main document, we've covered the main things that are important today. So in terms of the order of presentation, it's pretty much as outlined there. So we'll just very briefly recap on the method and sample, just to kind of give kind of overview of how we did it and so on. I think probably most really familiar with that. We'll then get into some of the key details, going from campaign recall right down to activity, message takeout, and kind of understanding and attitudes towards activity. And then we'll just draw the whole thing to summary. I mean, essentially, what we did is we did three tranches of research. We did an initial benchmark wave in September 2019. So that was prior to any field work, prior to any advertising getting underway. So we really need to understand the kind of point before we got into the advertising, so we could assess the impact of the advertising. Then we did second tranche in November 2019. And then this third and final tranche in the middle of November this year. So it was online interviews, just over 500, broadly representative of the Greater Manchester demographic in terms of areas, boroughs, and demographics. Full information around the sample is in the appendix. But again, we've kept that balanced on each of the three waves. The key reason being to make sure that we could actually kind of reasonably track and make comparisons between the different waves and assess what is over time. So like I say, 507 online interviews, fieldwork conducted there in the middle of March. And I think Will and Nat already touched on this, so I won't labour the point. But obviously the context behind when we did the fieldwork is very important. Obviously the country was largely in lockdown at that point in time. We also saw there was a Sports England report around about the time that we did the fieldwork, saying about the impact of COVID-19 on activity levels throughout the UK. So obviously not a like for like comparison, it's a much broader study across the UK. But what that study did show was that many of the lower social economic groups were particularly impacted by COVID-19 in terms of the activity they actually participated in. So these groups very much the kind of target or the key cohorts that we're looking at here. So again, just important to kind of bear that in mind as we look at the results that we go through. So if we're okay to jump on to the next slide after that, we'll start getting into the whole kind of section here on campaign recall, and we look at the different media that Will and Natalie have been chatting us through. So first of all, we're looking at these branded lift ads, so the poster ads, and saying, okay, straightforward question, did people actually recall this advertising or not? And we look at that across the different boroughs. So what we see there is a very respectable 15% of the sample across, so that represented 507 interviews. 15% of everyone that completed the interview said that they did indeed recall seeing these adverts. It varies quite a bit across the different boroughs, as you can see there. So very strong in Manchester, less strong in Salford and Trafford. But I guess obviously depending on where the kind of the branded lift ads were placed, obviously. So perhaps no major surprise there. What's quite encouraging is when you look at these results across the different cohorts, the key cohorts that we're looking at here. So the overall rep sample, 15%, and it tends to be higher amongst the key cohorts, which suggests that the targeting has worked well, particularly interestingly amongst the BAME community. But it hasn't seemed to have kind of quite had the same level of recall as amongst the workless, and that seems to be kind of recurring theme as we go through this the findings. But overall, total level, good level of recall, 15%, and generally, workless being the exception, it tended to be higher recall across each of the key cohorts. We also looked at, I won't go into the detail here, just in the interest of time, but we also looked at the kind of message takeout from the ads in terms of the kind of key messages that were taken from it. That's detailed in the appendix, and again, that was very good. So the good level of recall, and then those that did recall it, there was a good kind of takeout from the intended messaging. So that's all very positive. If we move on to the next one, we look here in terms of, sorry, just looking at that question area, we can't say specifically where people saw the ads. We can say from which area they were in and their level of recall, but we don't have level of detail. Okay, so in terms of the different stimuli then, so we've got the kind of 6 sheets of visual stimulus, the video and the radio there, and we look, okay, do you recall seeing or hearing these particular communications? And again, pretty positive there. You've got 13% recalling the 6 sheets, and again that varies across the different boroughs there. And then for video, Facebook, and in terms of the radio ads, you've got around about 1 in 10 saying that they recall either of those particular media, which is very positive. I think it was Natalie certainly touched on earlier that that level of recall radio, that's more than double what we saw in 2019. That was actually 4% at that point in time. So, that is an incremental increase is huge, obviously more than double where we were at that point in time. Again, interestingly, it varies across the boroughs, particularly strong in Thameside and also Manchester, where the overall recall of the campaign was particularly good in these two kind of boroughs. When we look at Facebook, again, pretty impressive there. 1 in 10 saying that they recalled the Facebook advertising, particularly strong in Manchester again. So I think that's quite important, because that's showing that, yeah, Facebook in its own right is digital in its own right is quite important. It's getting to 1 in 10 of the population, but also from two different angles. Around about a third of that group were saying they recalled kind of digital advertising, but no other advertising. And around about 2/3 were saying, yes, I recall digital and other advertising as well. So it's working on two levels. It's actually reinforcing other elements of the campaign, but it's also giving you a much more incremental reach as well. You've got that 3% of the entire population saying, I saw Facebook advertising and none of the other elements of the campaign. So it's extending the reach, but also reinforcing the message for people who have seen other media as well. So hopefully working on two quite different levels. So if we move on to the next slide then, we'll look at that, again, the three different forms of communications there, and we look at how that's recalled across the different key cohorts that we're assessing. So again, you look at the visual stimuli there, you can see that it's particularly well amongst YP&F, but particularly interesting when you look at, so that's a very strong finding in itself. But I think if you look at radio, you know, particularly strong amongst young people and families and YP&F, and if you look at video of Facebook again, it's actually significantly higher amongst the four cohorts than it is amongst the overall population. So when you were talking about the targeting earlier on and how that's kind of manifested itself, generally speaking, as I say, acknowledging that workplace, it doesn't seem to have quite hit us strongly with them. But generally speaking, we seem to be hitting a situation where, you know, the key cohorts are much higher level of recall, particularly for Facebook. So really, really encouraging there. And again, significant levels of these groups also saying that they recall Facebook only and no other elements, giving you that incremental lift, like I say. So if we can move on to the next slide, just bringing all that kind of recall together. So what's that telling us then? We've looked at the different media and we've sort of said, okay, what do people recall? What is the totality of the campaign? So across the whole campaign, we've got 30% of the entire sample saying that they recall at least one element of that counts advertising. So that's pretty strong, particularly against the background that's been described and the context that's been described at the beginning. And you can see there across the different boroughs how that pans out, particularly strong amongst Hampshire and also, as I mentioned, and also Manchester. But I think it was Will that said earlier on about the fact they were able to get such strong reach across all the boroughs. And that's very much reinforced here, where we see across all the boroughs, at least 1 in 4 recalled some element of advertising. So that's really, really strong. It's not like it's disparate across the boroughs. It's pretty consistent, some stronger than others, but a baseline of at least 1 in 4 across each of the boroughs, seeing at least one element of the advertising. And again, coming back to this, when we looked at wave 2, I know it's not necessarily too much of a focus, but the overall recall was 24%. So at this stage, you know, we've seen that build up quite considerably. And then looking at the overall recall levels, let's say, irrespective of media, what's the overall recall levels across the different cohorts? As I say, the overall representative sample is 30%, and on 3 of the key cohorts, you're way above that. So, you know, clearly the targeting has worked. That these key cohorts, workplace accepted, are much more likely to be kind of recalling the campaign than the population. And again, just very final point on that slide, really, we just noted a few points at the bottom. I won't go through them in detail, but again, we just wanted to understand, you know, okay, it's all very well people seeing or hearing the adverts. Are they taking out the right messages? And you can see there at the bottom that, you know, there's a huge proportion for taking out the right messaging. In terms of these statements at the bottom, more than 9 out of 10 agreed with at least one of these statements that are relevant to them. So good overall recall, and in terms of message takeout, that is also very positive. So that's the kind of campaign recall and messaging. If we can move on to the next section, please. So if we just look here at kind of activity levels. So what we're seeing here on this slide is on the left-hand side, if you look at weekly activity levels across the kind of representative sample, we've got the benchmark wave, which I mentioned in the dark blue bar, right through to wave 3, which is the November 2020 wave. And you can see the reported levels of activity across each of these 3 waves. What you're really seeing is there are some nuances, but essentially you're seeing a relatively flat picture. What we're seeing is, if you look at the active levels, that's slightly increased from the benchmark wave up till now, going from 37 to 41%. On the flip side of that, what we're seeing is the inactives have slightly increased since November 2019, going from 24%, and then there's been a slight drop in the proportion that they're fairly active. But I think the broad picture is that it's relatively steady. You know, as I say, there are a few nuances there. When you look at and again, I'll leave you to go through the details of this at your own time, but when you look at the details of this across the key cohorts, it's a broadly similar picture, where we're tending to see that a slight polarization in at the level of actives, fairly actives, is tending to be fairly steady or maybe slightly up. But in terms of the number of inactives, that's also the case. As I say, it does vary across the cohorts. The cohort there in terms of activity, where it's perhaps slightly less oppressive, is young people and families, where there has been a bit of a drop. But it's important to say there that, you know, irrespective of whether people recall the campaign or not, we've seen that the impact of COVID on this has been hugely influential. If you look at the comment at the bottom there, the leisure centres being closed has had an impact. So, you know, very often it's people are kind of the whole kind of environment that we've been working in during this wave that's had an impact. But generally pretty steady over the piece. And when we think back to that Sport England report that I referenced at the beginning, it does appear to be a better picture here than perhaps we've been seeing elsewhere. And then just very briefly to touch on the left-hand side, where we look at activity levels, you can see there that if people are aware of the advertising, they're more likely to be active or fairly active, which again sort of indicates that there's a positive response to the advertising. So just very briefly, the next chart we'll just touch on very briefly. If we move on, please. Yeah, so here it's just looking at that young people and families cohort again in a little bit more detail. When we ask them about the extent to which they feel that their children are active, that really is quite striking when you look from the first wave through to now. In terms of the proportions reporting that the children are active, it's very positive. I lift from 15 to 30 to 43, so pretty significant. And probably as important is the fact that there's the big drop each time in the proportion of parents saying they just don't know. So for any of those who were involved in the very beginning of this campaign, when we did the pre-stage, we were saying, look, this 3 out of 5 young parents and families are saying they just simply don't know if their kids are active or not. So the fact that they're actually they're paying much more attention, they're much more kind of aware of whether the kids are active or not, it's a huge plus. Obviously, there'll be other elements at play there as well, with maybe some of the kids not being at school and maybe they're more aware of what's going on with them and so on. But certainly you can see a clear kind of pattern there with the campaign. And then just very briefly on the right-hand side, this is amongst all parents, as people and families, and we can see that again, people much more likely to know what their levels of their kids if they're aware of the advertising rather than if they're not. So yeah, so I think what we're seeing is a huge knowledge of parents, their children's activity. So just two or three more charts to finish off. If we go on to the next slide, where we're looking at attitudes towards and understanding of physical activity. Just to explain this chart, what we do is we ask in each wave, okay, a number of statements here, which people can view, and we ask them to what extent they agree with these different statements. So the green bar is obviously the focus on the November 2020, and then it's point of comparison. We've got November 2019, and then the benchmark. So I think the key takeout really here is that, generally speaking, the data is very steady. There's no major changes. You look at most of these readings, they're very similar across the 3 waves. Where we see the big differences are, and again, it's quite instructive, I believe, is I do enough. So first of all, I have access to a good range of facilities, opportunities for physical activity. That was steady between September 2019 and November 2019. We see a significant drop this time. So just having access to facilities and opportunities for physical activity, major drop during this particular wave of fieldwork. Like I say, we've already seen a verbatim quote there around the lecture centre and so on. So that's clearly an impact. And then the other big drop is I do enough physical activity for my age. That's a significant drop there. But you can read that in 2 ways. That could be seen as a positive, because we've generally seen that the level of physical activity is broadly similar. There's some dips here and there, but it's broadly similar. But there's this feeling that they're not doing enough now. So it's almost like a kind of mentality change there. And I think there's a kind of appetite to do more exercise moving forward. Again, just very briefly, quote at the bottom right-hand side, lockdown has made it less easy to exercise. I need to do more. So yes, people are saying they don't have the facilities. They're feeling they should be doing more physical activity, but a lot of them have seen the advertising, it's had an impact, and there is that mentality that they want to do more and they intend to do more. So just one more slide we could move on to, and then I'll summarize for you. So we're looking here at recommended daily activity levels and the extent to which people are aware of them. And that has remained pretty steady really throughout the campaign. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see, again, slight shifts, but really it's a broadly similar picture. We can see, again, it's relatively steady amongst the cohorts, a little bit of changes here and there. But I think what's quite important is that if you look at these kind of figures, again, even in terms of awareness of recommended daily activity, the advertising's worked really well. It's almost been fighting against the whole issue of COVID. If you look at that quote at the bottom, I saw an advert saying 30 minutes, not sure if the restrictions have changed that. So again, just bringing in that slight element of doubt there. But certainly, amongst those who have seen the advertising versus those that haven't, there's a significantly higher proportion saying that they need to do 30 minutes plus compared to those who haven't seen the advertising. So hopefully, that's again, some pretty positive feedback on the whole campaign there. So if I just draw to a close, please, there's a couple of final slides to summarise it all. So in terms of campaign recall, we saw, pretty positive levels of recall there, almost 1 in 3 across the whole of Greater Manchester, saying that they recalled some element of the campaign. High levels of across all audiences, although less so amongst the workplace as we talked about, but the other key cohorts particularly strong. Particularly strong recall in Manchester and Thameside and Glossop, but across all boroughs we saw at least 1 in 4 recalling the campaign. Around 1 in 10 recalling Facebook advertising, and about a third of those didn't actually recall any other form of advertising. So like I say, on one hand it's reinforcing the other messages of the other media, but it's also giving you incremental reach as well. In terms of activity levels, slight drop in proportions classifying them as active. But again, those who do recall the advertising more likely to be active and fairly active. We saw that point there about the young people and families cohort much more likely to be knowledgeable about the level of their children. Particularly, that's really tracked very positively across the 3 waves in terms of increasing that. And quite clearly, activity is positively influenced by the That Counts campaign, and obviously that's we've seen the kind of lack of facilities and the during cohort have been a kind of counterbalance to that, but the advertising has fought that very well. So final slide, and I will wrap up then. If we just look at the attitudes towards and understanding of physical activity, largely consistent. We do see, you know, significant drops in proportions saying that they have access to facilities, as we've talked about, good access to facilities. That's been supported by anecdotes. But there's also this feeling that they don't do enough physical activity, but that appetite to do so more moving forward. It's almost like a recognition that they're not doing as much as they would like to. Wasn't quite as strong previously. Awareness of recommended activity is broadly in line with what we saw a year ago. So overall, our view would be, from an independent perspective, the campaign has positive levels of recall, particularly successful in targeting these key audiences, less so for workplace. It's very encouraging that Facebook advertising has increased recall of the campaign overall and also within key cohorts. We've already talked about the success of radio, which has been, you know, very, very clear from the data. So I think we're seeing that COVID-19 has had a huge impact, and also in terms of messaging, we saw, you know, that quote there about, you know, I saw an advert saying 30 minutes, not sure if that still holds true or not. But I think the overall picture is very, very good recall, good understanding of the campaign. And I think given the national picture, which we talked about at the very beginning, it looks like the campaign may have been a really key tool in tackling and mitigating what could otherwise have been a major drop in activity levels during the pandemic.